First time that I encountered it was when the then called President's Committee on Mental Retardation published what we called the Blue Book, which was the Principles of Normalization in Human Services, and it was really a monograph at that time, introduced to Wolfensberger, heard about this fellow Bent-Nirye. He actually came over here, toured around. I happened to be with him at one of the tours on the West Coast in institutions in California, as were some other people. And we began to get a flavor, because that was pretty early in the development of non-institutional services in this country. I think Nebraska had begun NCORE in the maybe mid-late 70s, early 80s, and stuff was starting to happen in Michigan, but most of the stuff in this country in the early 80s was still institutional, and if we had community living, it was sheltered workshops, it was segregated schools, and usually the sheltered workshops had grown up from the private schools that parents had created in the 60s and the 70s. I was in Dallas in get my years right here, 75. We opened the first group home for women with very mild intellectual disabilities, 8 of them. Today they'd be in their own apartments with support, but that was nirvana then, because the alternative was the Denton State School up the road about 36 miles away. That was the system. We did this initially with private money from a foundation and a service club, and we thought it was wonderful. Now, of course, today we would say that's not wonderful, probably for anybody, but certainly not for those women. They should be having a much different kind of life. So that was my first introduction to Wolfensberger, was through the President's Committee on Mental Retardation. I don't remember if that was 78, 79, 80, but someplace in there. And I thought it was interesting, and I read it, and there were some discussion groups about it. And then it was several years later before I actually met Wolfensberger, heard him speak and sort of pull out the pieces, condemn the immorality of most of what we were doing in this country, and from there began to try to tinker with what was he really saying, what was Bent-Nirye really saying, what did it mean? And I was one of those people who Wolfensberger probably said was going to get in bed with the devil because I was told I needed to learn and understand Medicaid. And I did, and I think I learned how to use Medicaid in a constructive way, but the person who taught it to me said, Allan, you need to learn this. Actually, a person from Minnesota, Bill Copeland, did the original work on Medicaid maximization. And Bill said to me at a meeting, when I asked good questions, you need to learn this. I said, I'm a systems change guy, I'm an advocate, I don't want to do this stuff. And he said, I'm telling you, you need to learn Medicaid. I'm thinking, who is this guy? I don't know him. And I said, okay, I'll bite. How come? And he said, why does Willie Sutton rob banks? And I said, oh. And was he right? That's where all the money was and is today. So there I was learning this Medicaid thing while wrestling with the principles of normalization, and of course that then came back out in a paperback book, white cover with a red circle on it, from the Alan Rohr Institute in Canada. And of course I had 3 copies. I've given a couple away to museums, but I have my own copies still at home. And I read it, again, cover to cover, marked it up, dog-eared it, and whatever. One of the things that Wolf taught me beyond the fundamental principles was a corollary, which I think happened to the principle of normalization, and that is that every good idea has within it the seeds of perversion. It's a great quote. I use it all the time. I give him due credit for it. Every good idea has within it the seeds of perversion. Normalization got perverted in this country. It got distorted because the power of words got twisted. The institutional parents, the old guard parents, what do you mean, my kid's not normal and now you're telling me we're making them normal? That's not what the principle says, but that's how people heard it because they didn't want to deal with the real stuff. So the perversions and the distortions rapidly got developed in terms of this only works for people who are quote unquote high functioning. I don't know what that means, but that was running around a lot. And for those of us who were trying to really get our arms around the underlying construct, which is people come in assorted shapes, sizes, colors, and disability types. And it's part of the human condition, and quote, I think they're more like us than different from us, and they're entitled to have as normal a lifestyle and the rhythm of the day and all of that. That began to challenge people like me in terms of, as the group homes were emerging, God, this is certainly better than the big funny farm, but it is pretty regimented, and it's not a normal rhythm. Everybody comes home at 3 or 3:30 from the day program and hangs out, and then at 5 or 5:30 it's time to eat, and then at 8 o'clock or 8:30 it's lights out, because those are the house rules. And so I think a number of us struggled with sort of the transformation from step 1 to step 2 to step 3, but we're always struggling with how do we get to truly implement this value-based principle, which is people ought to have a life. And I think if we cut through the principle of normalization, today that's what we might say, is people with disabilities have as much right to have a meaningful life in the community, no different from you or me or anybody else we know. They may not exercise at all, they may choose different kinds of things, but that menu ought to be out there. It's a fundamental right in our society. And so that's what I ended up taking away from normalization, was not so much about how do we rebuild the boxes in the service system, but what are the underlying values and principles that were being articulated there about human beings. And I think that got lost. I think people began to interpret normalization as a thing, as a process, very much like what we're seeing now with person-centered planning. And I know recently you spoke with Beth Mount. Personal futures planning, person-centered planning are constructs. They're theories, they're ideas, they're approaches. They're not models. And I think in this field, we look for a model, and once we get a model, then it becomes a cookie cutter. And for me, the cookie cutter then belies everything about normalization and individualization. Person-centered planning now, you can buy software packages. We'll do your person-centered plan, drop-down menu, pick one goal, drop-down menu, pick an objective. That's not person-centered planning. That's, again, Wolf. Every good idea has the seeds of perversion. It has gotten perverted. It was a great idea. It is a great idea. It's a great construct. But we've tended to do that from normalization going forward. My intuition says if we were to get a group of under 35 folks, young managers, DSPs, young professionals in the field of intellectual and developmental disabilities in a room, a reasonable sample, and ask them, how many of you are familiar with the Principles of Normalization by Wolfensberger? I would be amazed if 20% of the hands went up. And of those 20% that went up, I would say, and how many of you have read it or at least leafed through it? And my guess is on that one, very few. We don't teach the history well, and I worry about this. One of my mentors was the person who helped Wolfensberger get set up at Syracuse, which was the late Burton Blatt. Burt Blatt taught me two things: the power of words and language. Know your history, know your history, know your history. We don't teach history of disability policy very well. I did a training at the University of Connecticut last year for their USED. 40 transdisciplinary, interdisciplinary students. I couldn't have asked for a better cross-section. I mean, they really did it right. There were lawyers and speech-language pathologists and audiologists and social workers and special, and all that stuff. And they weren't all newbies. I mean, some were returning to graduate school folks. And we were talking about special ed. And I said, how many of you know the original Pennsylvania right to education case? Well, I didn't frame it that way. I just said, how many of you know how we ended up getting the Education for All Handicapped Children's Act in 1975? Of these 40 very bright people, one woman raised her hand. And I said, geez, can you tell me how you did that? She said, well, I was just interested, so I went and Googled it, and then I read some books. The rest of them didn't know anything. So I did a 10-minute sort of quick and dirty about the 26 federal right to education cases, because for me, here's the perversion. It'll come back many ways. People believe the problem with the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act is the federal government isn't paying 40% of the extra cost, which is what the law says it's supposed to do. They're paying 12, 15, 18. And I remind them that was probably a mistake in the law. This is a civil rights law. It was done after 26 federal constitutional lawsuits that all kids have a right to go to school. And so what happened is the federal policy, which said we want to help, has now been distorted, perverted, where the excuse is, oh, we would do it right if we only had the money, and I maintain it's a red herring. If we gave the full 40% next year, we would find new excuses why kids weren't included in getting appropriate supports. So for me, part of this issue, whether it's Wolfensberger or anybody else, Principles of Normalization, is somebody's got to be capturing this and giving it back to the next generation, at least in a way that they have some context for how do we get here? Why do we start to close institutions? Yes, there were lawsuits, but there were some other valued principles that were coming along on a parallel track that gave us a framework to say why we need to do better beyond a rights framework in terms of a meaningful life. And can we argue that the Principles of Normalization could interlock very nicely with the United States Constitution and the Bill of Rights? Yeah, I could probably make that case. But that's not where it came from. It came from some core principles about human dignity and human beings and human life, having nothing to do with the Constitution. But in this country, can we enmesh them? Yeah, I think that's a good thing, because we are a land of laws. And so we've done that. But my fear is 10 years from now, the principle of normalization in human services will be something those of us in the retirement world will talk about the good old days, unless it's brought back in some kind of a contextual reference about this was a building block. It wasn't the panacea, wasn't the magic bullet. And frankly, Wolf, if he would look at public policy, which I know he doesn't tend to do, might be really excited to read what first went in 1992 in law, which says disability is a natural part of the human experience. It in no way diminishes the right of the individual to, and there's like 7 bullets, including fully participate in community life, have a career, have meaningful, all that stuff. I might be able to easily say those legal constructs, that frame of reference, that definition, is really an extrapolation from the principle of normalization. I don't know that that was in the head of Bobby Silverstein working for Senator Harkin at the time. It may not have been. But that might be, now, and I'm just thinking out loud with you, one of the most phenomenal impacts of it just sort of transformed its way into the culture of how we think about people with disabilities, because that came 2 years after the ADA. And the ADA didn't really give us a construct. It just says equality of opportunity, independent living, all that. It's nice stuff. But this gives us a construct that says disability is part of life. And the way I would say that is some people are born with it, get it in early childhood, acquire it in adolescence or adulthood, and most of us, not all of us, if we live long enough, are going to experience some form of disability or disabilities.